Association webinar entitled Promoting Inclusive Excellence in Your Kinesiology Academic Unit, Strategic Principles and Practices to Consider. The webinar will be presented by Dr. Jared Russell from Auburn University and Dr. Langston Clark from the University of Texas at San Antonio. I will provide more information about them in a moment. My name is Jeff Fairbrother, and I am the Associate Dean for Academic and Faculty Affairs in the College of Education, Health, and Human Sciences at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I'm also a professor in the Department of Kinesiology, Recreation, and Sports Studies. I chair the AKA Communication Committee that organizes these webinars, and I will serve as facilitator for today's presentation. This webinar is scheduled for 1 hour and will be recorded and available for playback. By the end of the day tomorrow, you can expect an email from us containing the link to the recording. The link will also be available on the AKA website. Just go to Events and Services and then select AKA Webinars. All microphones and phone lines are muted for this webinar, so we ask that you communicate with us using the Zoom chat feature. You can access the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. This will open the chat screen in which you can enter your question. By default, all chat questions are visible to everyone participating. We will monitor the questions throughout the presentations. Afterwards, I will share submitted questions with our presenters, and they will answer as many as possible during the Q&A segment. Now, I would like to give you some background information on our speakers, Drs. Jared Russell and Langston Clark. Dr. Russell is a professor of kinesiology, specializing in physical education teacher education at Auburn University. In addition to his faculty role, he serves as the School of Kinesiology's Assistant Director and the College of Education's Chief Diversity Officer. He earned his undergraduate degree in Health and Physical Education from Morehouse College and his graduate degrees from University of Georgia in Physical Education and Sports Studies. His scholarship and outreach efforts focus on issues of diversity in higher education, graduate student socialization, and developing models for facilitating outreach efforts aimed at improving the overall wellness of traditionally underserved populations. Dr. Russell collaborates extensively with K-20 educators and local community agencies to promote social justice, outreach, and leadership development activities. His scholarly work has been presented at numerous conferences and published in both national and international journals. Dr. Clark is an assistant professor at the University of Texas at San Antonio in the Department of Kinesiology, Health, and Nutrition. Dr. Clark completed his PhD in Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Texas at Austin. Prior to obtaining his PhD, he received his MA in Adapted Physical Education from Ohio State University and a BS in Physical Education from North Carolina A&T State University. Given his experience as an undergraduate at A&T, a historically Black university, he has developed a passion for continuing development and elevation of minority-serving institutions. Dr. Clark's research focuses on the manifestation of social justice within HBCUs, physical education, teacher education, and athletics. His scholarly work can be found in Research Quarterly for Exercise and Sport, the Journal of Black Psychology, the Journal of Teaching and Physical Education, Quest, and the Race, Gender, and Class Journal. Dr. Clark has made numerous presentations focused on social justice at a variety of national and regional conferences. He seeks to create platforms for diverse voices from minority-serving institutions at conferences like the Pete and Heat Conference, Shape America, and South by Southwest EDU. Now that you know a bit about our speakers, I will turn over the audio to Dr. Russell. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you find the webinar to be stimulating and informative.
Thank you, Dr. Fairbrother, for that wonderful introduction. Good afternoon to everyone. Today we'll be talking about inclusive excellence and its application to kinesiology academic units from a leadership and organizational structure perspective. I will be teaming up with Dr. Langston Clark, who will drill down on how inclusive excellence can be demonstrated by faculty as they implement various pedagogies and seek to meet the needs of a diversity of students who have their own unique respective learning styles and needs. First, I'd like to say greetings from both UTSA and Auburn, And we greatly appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to come have this conversation with us. And I look forward to not only the presentation, but also the discussions that we have after the formal presentation is done. I'd like to start off before we dive into the meat of the presentation to please consider this graphic as a catalyst for you to consider higher education topics such as diversity, inclusion, equity, and social justice from a different perspective that we usually do. I want you to better serve all students. So as leaders, we must consider a shift in our traditional mindsets and practices to make our environments, our academic units, and our classrooms specifically more inclusive. I hope this presentation serves as a means of encouraging you to seek further information regarding inclusive excellence, as well as taking a closer look at your pedagogy. We will work to hit 3 key topics: contextualize diversity and inclusion, discuss definitions and principles of inclusive excellence, focus on teaching as a means of promoting inclusive excellence, and then we get into our question and answer session where we hopefully will get questions that kind of probe a little deeper about inclusive excellence and how we can apply it to our settings. But to lay a foundation for our discussion, we have to be familiar with how we view different things. As this picture points out, depending on what part of the elephant you're touching, you might have a different perspective. And I would like to say diversity and inclusion and inclusive excellence is something like that in mindset. Depending on what angle or what perspective you come from, it may impact how you perceive it. So one of the first things I want to do is settle in on some diversity, inclusion, and inclusive excellence definitions. So we have a common platform from which we're going to work. As many of us have seen this iceberg picture before, diversity comes in many forms. The majority of our attention is usually focused on the visible portions of the iceberg. However, there are many other variables and attributes to consider from a diversity standpoint. So I will ask you to take a more comprehensive view of diversity and not focus so much on race, age, language, ethnicity, and so forth. There's many other factors that go into effectively setting up an environment for inclusive excellence. Similar to diversity, there are many definitions and perspectives of what inclusion means. For a really basic premise and starting point, this slide points out something very important. It's when all individuals within a unit or an organization are valued and respected, and their success is seen as the organization's success. Again, inclusion is not about just inviting people to the party, but it's about having them engage in activities at the party so that everybody has a good time. Inclusion is building an environment in which all people, regardless of their traits and backgrounds, are able to flourish. Consequently, when done effectively, inclusion allows the organization to flourish as much as their people within the organization. Inclusive excellence drives this point home. And this is my early attempt at a happy Valentine's Day for everybody, by the way. Inclusive excellence is the recognition that in order for the organization to be successful, all constituents have to be supported, valued, and nurtured. It is not a top-down only or a bottom-up only perspective. Everybody has to engage, understand each other, and work towards a common goal. The model for inclusive excellence that I've used through the years has 5 major areas of emphasis. These areas of emphasis are important not only for students, but faculty, staff, and leadership to consider. The areas are access and success, community engagement, organizational infrastructure, training and education, organizational climate, and intergroup relations. Access and success points to how students, faculty, staff, leadership are able to access an environment and gain the resources they need to be successful. Also, it points to how do we monitor success? How do we define it? From a student perspective, it can be learning outcomes. From a faculty perspective, it could be promotion to associate professor or higher up. Community engagement is how do we interact with the greater community that we serve as a unit? What areas are we emphasizing when we engage with individuals from those communities? Organizational infrastructure points to the resourcing and development of units or individuals who serve specific needs to encourage the development of an organization and an environment that is conducive to everyone being successful. A classic example would be the Chief Diversity Officer. Is the Chief Diversity Officer supported, valued, and resourced so that they can develop programming to help all students and faculty be successful? Training and education points to how are we developing talent, supporting talent, and nurturing talent. A classic example of that would be implicit bias training for faculty search committees. Are we providing those kind of training and educational opportunities so that all individuals can develop their skill sets and their styles of leadership, as well as pedagogy and so forth? And organizational climate intergroup relations points to how are we developing an environment where everybody is valued and also individuals have opportunities to discuss and report issues that may be negatively impacting their success. Example of this will simply be a climate study, looking at how students feel about invitedness, support, being nurtured, and valued by leadership. And all of these areas come together point to inclusive excellence as an opportunity for leadership to better develop environments that everyone can be successful in. When done well, inclusive excellence principles and strategies will allow for organizations to sustain and value individuals within it. When all these individuals are supported and inclusive excellence principles are integrated effectively, there should be a sense of fairness and respect, value and belonging, a sense of safety and openness to be themselves, and empowerment and growth. Again, inclusive excellence is more than just simply making people feel good. It's about setting a situation up where individuals can not only feel good, but they can flourish and be successful even beyond their time in that particular unit. What also is important to point out about inclusive excellence is that it's more than just one or two individuals working hard to make things right for everybody. If you can see from the graphic, the areas that are kind of highlighted: student access and success, organizational climate, intergroup relations, student training, and education. These are the key areas that we can think about when we start thinking about teaching. Teaching is at the forefront of what we do as an institution. So when we think about inclusive excellence, there should be a synergistic approach to how all the units are working together to provide opportunities for inclusive excellence principles to be exhibited. There should be an alignment and integration across units that support student growth, faculty growth, staff growth. Inclusive excellence, along with diversity, inclusion, and equity, should be valued by the unit. There should be resources available to individuals who are seeking to better make the environment for students and faculty and staff. And it should be a priority. If you think about strategic planning, what are the priorities that your unit have put forth? Again, teaching is at the forefront of what we do. So when it comes to teaching and faculty choices of pedagogy, inclusive excellence directly impacts the highlighted areas in the figure provided. So we like to dig a little deeper into how do we as faculty meet the needs of a growing and a diverse pool of students. What pedagogical assumptions do we make about the impact and effectiveness of our teaching? Are we meeting the needs of our students? Or are we simply teaching as we were taught and doing somewhat of a disservice to our students who have different and unique needs? My colleague, Dr. Clark, will be discussing these questions and issues as we go further. At this point, I will turn the presentation over to him and allow him to take over.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are in the country. I want to thank AKA for having me here to speak today, Dr. Russell specifically for the invitation. And just, I want to set sort of context for the perspective that I'm coming from. Most of my research and where I work now is contextualized in minority serving institutions, but I also have an appreciation for large, predominantly white institutions that are research intensive. So much of what I'm going to talk about is going to come from my perspective as a student and also as a faculty member in both settings. And so hopefully I think what I have to offer is valuable to you in the ways that we think about, we engage our students in teaching in kinesiology and the related disciplines. So if you look at the puzzle on your screen right now, these are some of the typical strands of diversity that we talk about. age, race, gender, culture, what have you. But I want to throw in a slightly different piece of the puzzle for my part of the presentation, while also considering these other strands of diversity. And that is the first generation college student, or maybe even the non-traditional college student. Because where I teach now at the University of Texas at San Antonio, more than 1/3, probably closer to 50% of our students are first generation college students. And this strand of diversity is the one that sort of transcends, I don't want to say transcends, but goes across all other different strands of diversity. I have non-traditional students, I have Black students, I have white students, multilingual, multicultural students who are first generation college students. So I think we're having some trouble because I see a screen that's not the one that we should be at. Dr. Russell, can you put the PowerPoint back up? There we go. Sorry about the delay. So I want to take us to some concepts for diversity and teaching that come from teacher education. And so I want us to kind of focus on these ideas or notions of being culturally relevant or culturally responsive, the two boxes in the middle of your screen. And so oftentimes some of the buzzwords that we hear now are these notions of being culturally relevant or responsive, and which is rooted in multiculturalism, multicultural education, and even before that has roots in ethnic studies. Scholars have called for approaches now that sort of transcend what it means to be culturally responsive or culturally relevant, for approaches that are more culturally sustaining. This is a change in terminology that highlights the linguistic and ethnic and cultural diversity, but also sort of talks about explicitly helping students maintain who they are while navigating the mainstream. So it asks those who are in the position of being the educator to sort of not just be culturally relevant or responsive. So it means more than just using pop culture references in your classes to make connections to the learning or your pedagogy, but sort of creating an environment where students are able to maintain who they are, but also successfully navigate mainstream disciplines or mainstream institutions. So I think that this approach or this idea to teaching is one that will allow us to increase diversity among students and faculty within kinesiology and the related disciplines. In a context that is historically Black or minority serving institution, the idea of being culturally sustaining has been, research has shown to be slightly different, in that professionals aren't just prepared to navigate mainstream institutions, but they're also prepared to go back into their own communities and serve as role models and professionals, regardless of their discipline. So I want us to think about these three questions. Who are we preparing? How are we preparing? And what are we preparing them for? Students are not monolithic. There's more diversity within groups than there are between groups. And so as we think about whatever context that we're teaching, you may be at a university where all of the students may seem like they're the same, but I want you all to keep in mind that within groups, there's a tremendous amount of diversity, both ethnic and linguistic. Then there may be also designations such as being a first generation college student, being a veteran, or being a student who is non-traditional. So this brings us to thinking about how we teach or how we prepare these students. Just because you were taught one way in your K through 12 experience or your experience from undergrad through PhD doesn't mean that you should teach the same way to the students that you have right in front of you. one of the things that I try to be mindful of in my teaching is that, and this is not to be arrogant, that in most of my classes as an undergraduate student, I was one of the best students in class. And I think that most of us who have PhDs, who are scientists and scholars, assume or have a perspective that all the other students in class, all the students that we have in our classes should be the same way that we were in class. And that's just not the majority of the students in class. And then lastly, what are we preparing them for? Most universities that are Tier 1 or R1 schools are producing scholars and scientists to go back to R1 and Tier 1 schools. And so these are also the universities that are most likely to produce people with PhDs who will become scholars and scientists. And so we need to be mindful of preparing our next generation of kinesiology professors and faculty to not just go into R1 or Tier 1 schools, because a lot of students that we will be teaching and preparing won't be in the same types of schools that we got our doctorates from. So our approach to preparation of scholars needs to be mindful of that we're not just reproducing clones who are just like we are, but people who are going into schools that are very different in terms of resource and population from the ones that we got our PhDs. So here are some definitions of first-generation college students. So I did a similar presentation within the Invisible College at the American Educational Research Association, I believe it was last year. And when I went over these definitions, a lot of the scholars and scientists in the room didn't even know that they were first-generation college students. So neither parent or guardian completed a 4-year degree. And there's some other definitions that they have out there, but this is the basic definition. Some students get confused because maybe they had an older sibling who graduated before they did, and so they may not consider themselves to be first-generation college students. This is important for us as faculty to sort of recognize, because students who are high-achieving first-generation college students may be missing out on opportunities. For example, a lot of universities have what's called the McNair Scholars Program, which is a federally funded program designed to help increase the population of ethnic minorities and women who get PhDs, and it has a particular focus on STEM fields, which is something that kinesiology falls under. I also want us to kind of think about that the cultural sustainment needs of first-generation college students sort of runs across ethnicity, race, and culture, because if you have no sort of family history, parents navigating college, you're entering a new culture, a new college culture that's very different from one that you maybe had to, one that's very different from one that you came from growing up. For example, my mother, who was a first-generation college student herself, she gave me the ins and outs on going to college. She told me to make friends with the people in financial aid, because you never know when they may have more money for you. She's the one that prompted me to go and talk to my professors and not just settle for talking to the teaching assistant. So there's some social capital that students who are first-generation college students don't have that we need to be mindful of. And so one way to sort of bridge that gap is to make office hours mandatory at the beginning of the school year, because this gives you an opportunity to get to know your students and sort of demystifies who college professors are, because oftentimes students are afraid of us, particularly those who are first generation. So here are some statistics. First generation undergraduate students, 32% of college students in 2012 were first generation. In 4-year universities, this was 42%. In 2-year colleges, this was 48%. And the last statistic is interesting because many of these students, 22%, were enrolled part-time. And so there are different needs that a part-time student has than a full-time student has. And this may have implications for the way that we structure our classes. And it could be difficult in some instances where students have to have lab experiences in kinesiology, but maybe one solution for the part-time students who may not be able to come to class as full-time students is to offer online classes or hybrid classes when they're appropriate. I also want us to think about diversity in general, but also students who are first generation from an asset orientation. Oftentimes when we think about students who are diverse, we think about what they're lacking. And if we think about what students are lacking, we sometimes don't offer them the opportunities that they may need to become successful. So an example that I've sort of talked about where I work is that students who are oftentimes viewed as the top students get the opportunity to do research in the labs and get the opportunities to work one-on-one with faculty in independent studies. But research would show, and I think now it's common sense in teaching, is that students learn best in contexts that are authentic. So the students who would need the opportunity to work in a laboratory or to be hands-on, who aren't getting it through the classroom lectures or the PowerPoints, are the ones who don't get selected for the opportunities that best meet their learning styles or their needs. So that's something to think about. So we shouldn't just frame our students from what they lack. We also have to understand the assets that they bring. So one major aspect of this is that first generation students are aspirational. And so for those of us who weren't first generation college students, going to college was normal. But if you're the first person in your family to go to college, or the second person because you had a sibling, it means a lot. What it means for you being a representative or an example to the rest of your family members may have more meaning than it does for someone who has a long tradition of family members who have gotten their higher education. And so sometimes we don't think students value their education, but we need to be mindful of the fact that if you're the first person in your family or first generation college student, that going to higher education, getting your degree is something that you value, but you may not necessarily know how to negotiate or navigate. Oftentimes students who are first generation express linguistic diversity and may be able to speak in more than one language. This also sort of represents students who are international students as well. And so also being mindful of the fact that students engage in formal and informal modes of expression, that when you come into an environment such as kinesiology that has a very scientific shared technical language, that this is something, a bridge that we may need to build for our students in building their professional linguistic proficiency. Students are oftentimes very good at building social networks, making new friends and new relationships in an environment that's very different. Oftentimes students here where I work, they gravitate towards students that they went to high school with who may or may not even be in the same majors they do, but it provides a sense of social support. These students go through things that I think oftentimes a lot of us may not consider. So they have a deep sense of perseverance that goes beyond just them getting their degree or them getting their higher education. Oftentimes it's something where they're bringing their whole family with them and even recognizing their ancestors who may have contributed to them getting to where they are right now. Pluriversal. And so this is one of the notions that we need to be mindful of in terms of creating a culturally sustaining environment for these students, is that our students who are first generation or have a different sort of cultural background than that of the university that they're attending, they're operating in different worlds, even within maybe the same state. So as an undergraduate student, I came from New Jersey to Greensboro, North Carolina to go to college. So the environment got much smaller to me. But students who lived in the country of North Carolina going to the small town of Greensboro, North Carolina, in some ways were overwhelmed because to them it was a big city. So students who are first generation oftentimes demonstrate the ability to operate in multiple worlds, whether that be with their peers, at work, with their family. They operate in environments that have different value systems, and they hold multiple and competing systems of meaning. And so what talking loud might mean in a classroom at a large, predominantly white institution might be different than what talking loud would be at a smaller, historically Black college or Hispanic serving institution. And these differences might play out in the ways that students negotiate the social environment of the classroom. So when someone is at home, they may talk in a very different way, whether that be tone, lingual colloquialisms, than the way that they talk in a classroom setting. Common obstacles. Even though we want to have an asset orientation towards our students, we also want to be mindful of the fact that students do have some obstacles that they have to attend to if they're first generation college students, or even students who are transitioning from a community college to a four-year institution. They have to move to a large campus. In some instances, the university that they attend might be bigger than the town that they grew up in. The idea that they're bringing their family and their friends with them can also come at the cost of some guilt, feeling absent from family and friends. And so many times students who are first generation college students might find themselves going home every Friday after their last class. And so one of the conversations that I've been having to have with students is that maybe we can cut the amount of times that you go home down in half, because driving 3 hours is more than 3 hours. It's actually 6 hours. And in the preparation to go home might actually add an additional hour. So it's 8 hours of time that you could be spending studying, getting ready for class, or doing assignments. Culture shock. The college environment and many times represents a middle class sort of value system, which is very different from students who maybe did not grow up middle class. So something as small as having a debit card or a bank account might be something that students are introduced to the first time when they go to college. And all of this has implications for the way that we teach, because students oftentimes are stressed out because of money issues, and maybe even simply negotiating getting their food at the cafeteria might be something that we have to be mindful of. Students oftentimes might feel lost in college or have a lack of direction or sense of loneliness. It's interesting that you could be at a university that's bigger than the town that you grew up in and feel lost, or even feel lonely, when the setting that you're in now is bigger than the one that you came from. Students may oftentimes feel intimidated by being the only one. And being the only one might mean not just the only Black person or brown person or international student or gay person in the class. They may just feel like there's no one in here like me because the other students seem to be doing better than I am, and not recognizing that the other students are going through the same things that they're going through in a lecture hall that's filled with 100 to 200 students their freshman year. Some students fall through the cracks. You may be coming from a high school setting where you had really good relationships with teachers who were there with you from your freshman year all the way through your senior year. But then when you get to college, you're hitting the reset button and you don't necessarily have mentors or people looking out for you in the same way that you did when you were in high school. And then this idea of microaggressions. And microaggressions can take the form of race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, or even nation status. So an example is a story that I heard from some colleagues while they were in their PhD program, was that a faculty member identified this Hispanic male and this Black male and told them that they shouldn't take both of his classes in the same semester because it's going to be very difficult, because his classes were very challenging and rigorous. Whereas this professor may have thought that he was doing them a favor in protecting them, he actually lowered expectations for the students. And students sometimes can internalize these lowered expectations and think that maybe they can't do the rigorous work when in reality they can. Sadly, in this situation, one of the students, the Black male, decided not to take both of those classes in that semester, and it impacted how fast he was able to matriculate through his PhD program, where the other students sort of recognized it as a microaggression and lowered expectations because this particular faculty member didn't isolate or single out the other students who were thought to be more adept students at that time. And I sort of already talked about the finances and the time management But oftentimes we're not mindful of that as faculty when we assign textbooks that cost $200. And so maybe one of the things that we need to consider is going to open educational resources for our students so that they have access to resources and learning materials that don't cost as much money. So essentials for first generation college student success. The learning should be engaging. And this can happen even in large lecture hall style classrooms in the form of small groups, building learning communities within classes, or even doing flipped classrooms, creating a sense of belonging, building students' academic self-concept. And so when we have self-confidence, so when we have an asset orientation towards students, and we start to point out to students the assets that they have and they're bringing into the classroom with them, that is beneficial to building their self-confidence. A concrete vision of the benefits of college. I think clearly stating the goals and objectives and the purposes of majors and the purposes of specific classes and how it benefits them in the long run, so students have a larger view of how and what they're learning is necessary for their matriculation and their eventual careers, is something that we need to be mindful of. We also need professors who are competent teachers. I want to go back to this idea of creating a sense of belonging, which is related to professors who are competent teachers. And so one of the things that I do is a card game called Staff Meds, where students come in the first 2 minutes of class and they try to get through some vocabulary words as fast as they can, as many as they can in 1 minute. And so this is a challenge that I create for all of the students in class, but it helps to bridge the gap between the shared technical language of the field and the language that they have coming in as freshmen or undergrads or even PhD students. And it also builds this sense of belonging among the class, because I set goals not just for individuals, but for as a class to meet, to be able to go through the vocabulary within 1 minute by the end of the semester. So students are expected to go through all the vocabulary words and know them by the time the final exam comes up, and students are more aware of the language, and typically they do better on their examinations. So we need to sort of assess our values as kinesiology professors and as a field. One of the things that I've heard is, this comment here at the beginning. I heard Latinos, Latinas, Latinx communities don't value education. And so I begun thinking to myself, do we as kinesiology faculty value education? So keeping in mind that tuition costs are increasing. Tuition is tens of thousands of dollars at some institutions, and students are paying these fees, taking out loans and paying interest. So that was my first thought. The students are paying lots of money for their education. So it appears to me from an asset orientation that they do value their education. So we need to consider who taught us how to teach. At what point in our journeys were we ever explicitly taught how to be effective instructors in class? How much time do we spend planning for a class? Teaching is very difficult. And I think sometimes we just assume that if we go up there and go through the PowerPoints that we've done enough, or that if we teach the same class every year for 5 years, that it gets easier and that we're doing a good job. And this is not necessarily the case. Something I want us to be mindful of as we try to become reflective practitioners or reflective teachers is, how do you know you're a good teacher? And do we even care if we're a good teacher? And how do you know if you care if you're a good teacher? And this goes beyond student evaluations, because one of the things that has been controversial now in conversations throughout higher education are students' assessments of our teaching clear indicators of whether or not we did a good job teaching. Another comment that I've heard: don't worry about your teaching. It is okay to get a 2 out of 5 on your teaching evaluations. Now, I just said that teaching evaluations are not the best indicator of whether or not we've done a good job teaching, but this is part of a view or perspective or culture in higher education and even in kinesiology, because this was said to me by a kinesiology professor, that our research should take precedent over our teaching, but our students are paying thousands of dollars and have an expectation that we would be committed to being excellent instructors and teachers. Something to think about. A certified kindergarten teacher goes through a more rigorous teacher training than most kinesiology professors. And so again, I ask the question, do we value education? And I would argue that our students who have gone through K through 12, they made it past the third grade, because kindergarten, first, second, and third grade is where students are learning how to be students. They have more training in being a student, more experience in being students than many of us have training, formal training in being professors in a classroom teaching a multitude of students, whether they be first generation, ethnic minorities, or what have you. And so I want us to think about this. Are we doing right by our students by not being intentional about how we are prepared to teach? And if we're not, then I would argue that we're engaged in grand theft academia, considering the fact that students are paying tens of thousands of dollars and going into debt with the expectation that they're going to come to college and have professors who actually care to teach and actually care to improve their teaching, or maybe even have been trained to teach. Because oftentimes students don't even know that their faculty members have not been trained to teach, even though they may have some expertise in the content area. Content knowledge is not the same as pedagogical content knowledge. So as a discipline, things that we can do to be committed to excellence in teaching is remember our roots in physical education, and that perhaps we should push PhD requirements to have 9 credit hours of andragogical or pedagogical training. Maybe programs, I know that this is at the university level, should have a 1-year, first-year teaching induction program, which might extend tenure by 1 year. And perhaps as we go through the tenure process, that maybe we need to have a tenure teaching portfolio so that faculty members can demonstrate their competence in teaching. And so as a commitment as individuals, I would like to suggest these 2 books, one by James Lang, who really does a good job of contextualizing teaching in a sport context, which is related to kinesiology in some ways, and another one called Breakthrough Strategies, which is very much based on sort of teaching students who are first generation college students and ethnic minorities. And now I will turn things back over to Dr. Russell. Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you, Dr. Clark, for those words and those thoughts. And as I see we're getting close to wrapping up, a couple of summary points before we get into the question and answer phase. Operating in inclusive excellence calls for a comprehensive, strategic, and sustained effort to do that. Most importantly, as I stated from the very beginning, I want you to think about engaging diversity and inclusion-oriented materials, resources, and units on your campuses to get more information on how to effectively integrate inclusive excellence practices and strategies into your academic units. Remember, teaching is at the forefront of what we do. We have to take that into stark consideration when we're thinking about inclusive excellence. Are we meeting the needs of our students? Faculty and students are most impacted, whether they're the ones receiving the teaching or being evaluated for teaching effectiveness. And there are professional development opportunities available to faculty to better enhance their teaching practices, behaviors, and the curriculum. So again, thank you, Dr. Clark, for your words and your perspectives. And I will now turn the presentation over to Dr. Jeff Fairbrother to wrap us up.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you to Dr. Clark and Dr. Russell for great presentation. We'll now start our question and answer period, and we'll try to address as many questions as come up as we possibly can. just a reminder to all the attendees, if you type in your questions in the chat window and make sure that it's addressed to panelists and attendees so everybody can see them. I will select those and read them off and let Dr. Clark and Dr. Russell answer them. So I'll start us off though. This is for either one of you. You talked at the beginning about the this 5-point model of inclusive excellence. And I was wondering if you think about a department that's really trying to either get started in this area or get traction in this area, do you think there's one of those 5 areas would be a good first area to focus on, or would you advocate that they should try to do all of them simultaneously? And do you have any advice about how to approach that?
I would start, hate to say what I would start with, but access is important. You want to make sure you're doing everything you can to recruit a diversity of students, faculty, and staff. And typically when you have faculty from diverse backgrounds, students tend to get a better sense of belonging because they see somebody who's like them. Now, we take that for granted in most of our units because the majority of our students are white, Caucasian, and the majority of our faculty are. So that sense of I belong here is obvious. But for students from diverse backgrounds, if they don't see someone who looks like them, there's research to say that they don't quite feel connected and valued. So if I had to pick one area just to really focus in on, it would be access. How are we recruiting and getting students into our programs who have a diversity of experiences and background? And that's just not gender or ethnicity. As Dr. Clark pointed out, if you come from a rural part of the state and you come to the big city, whatever that might be, there's a curve there that students have to be accommodated for. And being able to have faculty and staff who are there to help them and nurture them is vitally important. First steps, take a look at your numbers. Data-informed decision-making is always great. So I would do a trend analysis of the students who are coming, undergraduate students who are coming into our programs, and also our graduate students who are coming into our program, and see where are those gaps at. And at Auburn, we have identified African American and Latino American as our priorities as far as diversity recruitment. That's not to say other groups aren't being sought after and recruited, but our state is 23 to 26% African American, but our student body is only about 10. So we have identified that as a crucial area that we need to do better in. Dr. Clark, you have anything to add?
I think you answered that question well. I think the access and success piece is especially necessary in terms of the way that we recruit and train future faculty members. So before I talked about the McNair Scholars Program. So I think if you can identify undergraduate students who are in underrepresented populations and give them opportunities to be trained to become faculty members, I think that's one of the things the department can do specifically to sort of take care of this issue of access to success and having role models, because you're preparing the future role models in kinesiology. So maybe it's as simple as like putting a call out saying, one, finding out if your school has a McNair Scholars Program, but then presenting that opportunity to your students as well, and having a strategy for identifying students who you may view as having the potential to get a PhD.
Great, thank you for those answers. What strikes me as interesting is that for many of us who have experienced a large enrollment growth over the last 5 to 10 years, your points about access, connection, and value are actually true for almost all of our students. They get sold on these low student to faculty ratios for the university as a whole, and they show up on our doorstep and they have a 1 to 90 student to faculty or faculty to student ratio. It's just obviously much more pronounced for the people who aren't in the majority groups. And so I think that connects with Dr. Clark's points about teaching, that these are examples that apply to how we should be treating all of our students.
Yeah, and I would add to that is another important ratio to consider is student to academic advisor.
Yeah.
We have to be very, I'm again using Auburn as an example. Our numbers were so high that they had to do group advising. And what tends to happen with group advising, even if done effectively, students hide, they don't ask questions. So it's a lot to be said about students who may not have the social capital or the experiences or individuals who can give them support navigating courses. For instance, what do you do when you're failing a course? Well, some students just sit in the class and just take the F. Other students, withdraw from the class and get their money back. It's all these different techniques that can help students navigate better. So we have to start looking at the numbers and how we are actually meeting the needs of student groups so that they can effectively access information.
Yeah, and Jeff, I would agree. When I was putting together my parts of the presentation, I was thinking about higher education and kinesiology as a whole. If we would just commit to being good teachers and good educators and providing an educational environment that's best suits our students, all students, I think we would see an increase in how we retain students of color, students across the broad array of diversity, what have you. Because oftentimes what's good for the student in the margins is good for all students.
Yes, that's true. So I have another question here. Do you have any thoughts on how diversity and inclusion efforts could be incorporated into a department's strategic plan? So the question is about, would you think making it a standalone priority, which calls attention to it, is preferred over trying to integrate it into all other priorities? Or do you have any thoughts on that?
Dr. Clark, want to start off?
Oh, man. I think just given the context that I'm in right now, I think that departments can have a strategic plan for diversity and inclusion, but I really think that needs to be a value that runs throughout the university, and that if the university is not setting the tone for diversity and inclusion, in my experience, I don't think departments will respond. I think it would be nice if departments would, kinesiology departments would take the lead on that. But I think it's more difficult to do if you're not in a university setting that is really committed to diversity and inclusion. I think from a strategic planning standpoint, though, within departments, and even sort of going back to teaching, it might just be something as simple as like having mandatory office hours so that you can get to know your students. And it doesn't have to be, multiple times in a semester, or it might just be having a situation where your students write at the beginning of the semester their educational history, who they are, and asking them to incorporate their identity, if they choose to give you a better sense of who they are. That's a strategy I think that could happen in classrooms. But I think the push for diversity and inclusion, in my experience, has been most effective when it comes from the university value system.
Yeah, I co-sign that. Going back to your question, is that should it be a theme or something that's woven throughout the fabric of the strategic plan, or should it just be a standalone? I've seen both be effective, as long as the goals and the metrics that are going to be used speak to diversity and inclusion. One interesting aspect of using diversity and representation of students as a metric that I've come across in the last year or so is that most units, undergraduate units, don't have control of who they admit. So that's usually done at university level. So you kind of get the students that you get. Now, graduate level, we accept our students. But undergraduate students show up and you meet their needs. So when you put in a strategic goal to increase the representation of students from a diverse background, and you're thinking about undergraduate students, if the university isn't on board, there's a disconnect there. Now you can do all the recruiting and high school meetings and all the stuff you want to do, but if the students can't get admitted into your institutions, they can't make it to your academic units. And that's one of the things that you have to be mindful of, what the university is doing versus what you want to do as a college or a school or a department. So it works both ways, but I would prefer to have it woven throughout, where every priority and goal in a strategic plan speaks to diversity and inclusive excellence.
Great, thank you for that response. We have probably time for one really brief question. I don't really, the nature of the topic doesn't lend itself to brief questions, but I'll just give you fair warning that I may need to interrupt you as we get near the end, okay? So how do we avoid focusing only on the most apparent forms of diversity, such as race and gender? You both talked about a lot of different types of diversity.
I think it goes back to your recruiting of faculty who are diverse in their perspectives, and the application of theoretical principles to different aspects of diversity. For instance, LGBTQ plus studies, or the impact of socioeconomic status on academic achievement. When you have faculty who have different perspectives coming in, that helps you to move beyond just looking at gender or race, because those are pretty much the most obvious. And I think it takes a little time. It takes time, and also you have to reward those faculty who are doing those kind of projects and that research. So to answer your question briefly, the more diverse you have, the diversity perspectives you put on any given subject or phenomena or topic, the more likely you are to move beyond what's so rudimentary in our minds, which is gender, ethnicity, and so forth. So it takes time, but you got to get the people together to think differently.
Thank you. That brings us, we're pretty close to at time, so I think we probably don't have the opportunity for another question. So I want to thank you both for a wonderful presentation and a great question and answer. I want to thank all of our attendees today for joining us. To the attendees, if you would please take a few moments when your webinar window closes to complete a short survey on today's webinar. We appreciate your feedback, as it helps us continually improve our webinar offerings. Remind you that we will email everyone a link to the recording of today's presentation so that you can view it yourself or pass it along to friends or colleagues. Please do that. Thank you again for your participation today, and thank you once again to our presenters. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, you as well.
Thank you.